Maria Francisca Isabel Josefa Antonia Gertrudes Rita Joana, born on December 17, 1734, was the eldest daughter of King José I of Portugal and Mariana Victoria of Spain. From the earliest days of her childhood, she was immersed in an atmosphere thick with religiosity, dynastic expectation, and a culture of courtly surveillance. As the presumptive heir to a deeply Catholic and absolutist monarchy, Maria's formative years were dominated by theological instruction and a sense of divine accountability that would eventually blur the line between conscience and delusion. Her tutors were handpicked by the Jesuits, who had powerful influence over the Portuguese court before their expulsion in 1759. They instilled in her a rigid understanding of Christian morality laced with Baroque notions of guilt, sin, and judgment. Maria's early writings reveal a precocious but anxious mind, prone to self-examination and fearful of spiritual failure. Unlike her more pragmatic father, she displayed little tolerance for compromise between royal authority and divine law. For Maria, monarchy was not merely a political role, it was a sacred charge to enforce God's will on earth. In 1760, Maria married her uncle Infante Pedro of Portugal, a match that raised no eyebrows in the context of Bourbon dynastic strategy, but later troubled moralists. The marriage, while reportedly affectionate, was also one of duty and reinforcement of Habsburg-like bloodlines. Their first son, José, was born in 1761, and immediately designated heir apparent, cementing a clear line of succession. In public, Maria conducted herself with the requisite grace of a future queen. In private, however, observers noted her frequent retreats into prayer and ascetic fasting behavior that became more intense with age. The 1755 Lisbon earthquake loomed large over Maria's early adulthood. Though she was not directly involved in post-disaster politics, the catastrophe, which killed tens of thousands and destroyed much of Lisbon, left a profound impression on the royal family. Her father leaned heavily on his minister, the Marquis of Pombal, to execute sweeping reforms and rebuild the capital. Maria, however, harbored deep misgivings about Pombal's Enlightenment-driven secularism and his suppression of the Jesuits. She saw his heavy-handed policies as both impious and corrosive to the divine order. As heir presumptive, Maria was increasingly vocal in her opposition to Pombal, believing his actions had courted divine retribution. She interpreted the suffering of the Portuguese people as a direct result of spiritual laxity within the monarchy and court. While her father tolerated her religiosity, he sought to shield her from politics. This only deepened her sense of alienation from the ruling apparatus, intensifying a pattern of spiritual withdrawal and internalization of blame that would eventually prove catastrophic. Despite the turbulence around her, Maria maintained the facade of royal composure. She bore 6 children, played her ceremonial role diligently, and cultivated an image of maternal piety. However, court physicians occasionally noted periods of melancholy and anxiety, which they attributed to female weakness or temperament, early euphemisms for what would later be understood as psychological distress. One physician described her as overly tormented by the weight of her conscience, an observation that would seem eerily prescient in years to come. An obscure but telling incident occurred in 1768, when Maria reportedly insisted that a court procession be halted because she had received a sign from the Virgin Mary warning her of hidden corruption among her attendants. While dismissed as eccentricity at the time, this episode marks one of the earliest recorded breaks from rational statecraft. It also reflects the intensity of her religiosity, one that merged the political with the spiritual in increasingly unmanageable ways. By the time King José Sr. died in 1777, Maria was 42 years old and fully committed to reversing the secular policies of her father's regime. She ascended to the throne as Maria I, the first undisputed queen regnant in Portuguese history. One of her first acts was to dismiss the now elderly Marquis of Pombal and subject him to legal scrutiny. Though he was never imprisoned, the humiliation was complete, a public repudiation of Enlightenment despotism and a signal that Maria intended to rule in accordance with divine law. But the victory came at a cost. Maria's decision to personally oversee judicial proceedings against Pombal consumed much of her mental energy. She pored over case files, consulted with clergy, and reviewed moral grievances with an almost obsessive attention to detail. Royal aides began to whisper that the queen was sleeping poorly, growing irritable and weeping uncontrollably during religious services. Some attributed it to the strain of office. Others noted a more troubling pattern. Behind closed doors, Maria exhibited increasingly compulsive behavior, prolonged periods of prayer in total darkness, sudden outbursts against minor staff errors, and fasting to the point of near collapse. She grew particularly obsessed with the idea of being unworthy to rule, fearing that her decisions might condemn her soul. One chambermaid recalled that the queen once refused to sign a tax decree until she had consulted 3 priests and confessed twice in a single day. Still in public, Maria remained functional. Her reign saw modest legal reforms, expansion of education, and continued colonial engagement in Brazil. But the contradictions were beginning to mount between a queen determined to fulfill her divine duties and a mind increasingly tormented by invisible sins. These internal pressures, once contained, were nearing a critical threshold. The psychological seeds of collapse had long been planted. The question was no longer if they would bloom, but when. In the early years of her reign, Queen Maria I exhibited a fervent sense of duty and justice, rooted in an unwavering belief that monarchs ruled by divine right and bore direct accountability to God. Her earliest acts as queen confirmed a dramatic ideological shift from her father's reign. The dismissal and symbolic trial of the Marquis of Pombal marked a public reversal of the Enlightenment-inspired authoritarianism that had dominated Portugal since the 1755 earthquake. Maria restored the influence of the clergy, revived ecclesiastical privileges, and rolled back numerous secular reforms. To her, the Enlightenment was not progress, but heresy. The early years of Maria's rule were marked by strong ideological conviction, but also signs of psychological fragility. She increasingly involved herself in minute details of governance, driven by a compulsion to root out sin and ensure the moral integrity of her policies. She personally reviewed petitions, reorganized seminaries, and demanded that royal ceremonies be performed with precise theological correctness. Her obsession with ritual penance and orthodoxy gave her court a distinctly medieval character, out of step with the modernizing trend of Europe's other monarchies. Foreign observers were initially impressed by her seriousness and resolve. British envoys described her as intelligent, pious, and rigorously moral. But they also noted her stiffness, lack of spontaneity, and refusal to engage in secular entertainment. The Portuguese court, which had once been famed for music and pageantry, grew increasingly austere. Balls and masquerades gave way to solemn liturgies and sermons. In private, the queen turned more inward, consulting confessors with increasing frequency and finding cause for alarm in dreams, omens, and the behavior of her children. These behaviors escalated as personal loss crept into her life. In 1786, her husband Pedro died of a sudden illness, and though theirs had not been a romantic marriage in the modern sense, Maria was deeply attached to him. His death triggered an emotional collapse. Witnesses reported that she wept uncontrollably for days, refused food, and secluded herself in her chapel, where she reportedly spoke aloud to her husband as if he were present. Her mourning became liturgical. She would dress in black and insist that the court follow extended periods of public grieving far beyond the customary timeline. This moment marked the beginning of her noticeable mental deterioration. She began to experience auditory hallucinations, claiming to hear voices condemning her to eternal damnation. The Queen's writings from this period show increased religious paranoia, a fixation on hell, and repeated references to divine wrath. She reportedly believed that God was punishing her not only for her own sins, but for the spiritual failings of the entire nation. Some accounts suggest that she refused to sleep in her chambers, believing them cursed, and instead spent nights in prayer or wandering the halls in disheveled clothing. These changes did not go unnoticed by her ministers or the foreign diplomatic corps. The papal nuncio in Lisbon reported that the Queen had begun to interrupt meetings with long, silent pauses or sudden sobs. She once halted a state reception because a thunderclap outside the palace had, in her words, sounded like the voice of judgment. Courtiers unsure how to respond began adjusting protocol to avoid triggering episodes. Some meetings were shortened, others were canceled altogether. Nevertheless, her government managed to function in large part due to the gradual empowerment of her eldest son, José, Prince of Brazil. José was considered dutiful and loyal, if not particularly brilliant. As his mother withdrew into increasingly erratic behavior, he assumed more administrative responsibility. Yet this transition remained informal as Maria refused to abdicate or acknowledge any loss of capacity. Her clergyman insisted that her suffering was a test of divine fortitude, rather than a medical matter, reinforcing her belief that prayer, not treatment, was the appropriate remedy. Tragedy struck again in 1788 when Prince José died unexpectedly of smallpox at the age of 27. The impact on the Queen was immediate and catastrophic. Already weakened by grief and paranoia, Maria descended into a state of mental collapse from which she would never fully recover. The prince's death was interpreted by her as a sign of divine disfavor. She reportedly screamed for hours upon hearing the news and then fell into a trance-like silence. Servants found her days later kneeling beside José's bed, murmuring Latin prayers with cracked lips and vacant eyes. Maria refused to allow his body to be buried for several days. She insisted that he would be resurrected or that an angel might yet intervene. When the embalming process began, she demanded to oversee it and insisted that parts of his clothing be preserved in reliquary-like containers. Aides reported that she would caress the prince's garments and talk to them as if they contained his spirit. One footman recalled entering the room and finding her clutching the corpse's hand, softly singing lullabies from José's childhood. The court was horrified. Though death was a familiar aspect of 18th-century royal life, such overt and prolonged displays of emotional disorder were deeply unsettling. Religious mourning was expected. Madness was feared. The Queen's grief had passed into the realm of the grotesque. She began to claim that her dead son spoke to her through the walls, urging her to repent and to cleanse Portugal of sin. Night after night she would lock herself in her chapel and scream psalms into the void, her voice echoing through the empty corridors of the palace. Ministers and courtiers now faced a dilemma. A reigning monarch was descending into psychosis, yet the concept of mental illness remained poorly understood. Treatments ranged from bloodletting to prayer. Institutionalization was unthinkable not only for a queen, but for a woman considered chosen by God. Instead, the court began quietly reducing her public appearances and shifting state business to her surviving son, João. The fiction of Maria's authority was maintained for appearances, but the reality was becoming untenable. As 1789 dawned the same year, revolution exploded in France. Portugal's monarchy stood at a perilous junction. The Queen, haunted by visions and voices, was slipping into darkness. Her court, increasingly governed by silence and avoidance, struggled to maintain order without exposing the growing truth that the woman anointed by God to rule his kingdom on earth could no longer distinguish between reality and revelation. The death of Prince José in 1788 not only severed the fragile thread anchoring Maria Thurer's psychological stability, it catalyzed a long descent into chronic and unrelenting madness. While grief alone does not explain the full scope of her breakdown, it served as the tipping point in a mind already strained by guilt, religious obsession, and a lifelong fear of divine punishment. With her husband dead and her beloved eldest son now buried, despite her protests, Maria became increasingly convinced that she was the instrument and the object of God's wrath. Her behavior soon shifted from alarming to unmistakably pathological. She ceased all attempts at decorum, and royal physicians noted prolonged episodes of sobbing, screaming, and violent thrashing. She claimed to see devils in her chambers and angels warning her of impending apocalypse. During council meetings, she would erupt into prayer-accused ministers of heresy, or fall into catatonic silence for hours. One foreign observer from the Spanish court recorded a chilling moment when the Queen demanded that the Council of State remove their shoes in her presence to avoid further contaminating holy ground. No event, however, so clearly encapsulated her decline as the strange and macabre handling of her son's death. Even after his burial, Maria reportedly demanded that his coffin be kept unsealed within her private chapel for frequent viewings. When this was refused by her attendants, she relented only to have his clothing brought daily into her rooms, where she spoke to them as if they were his proxy. The Queen referred to José in the present tense, often citing imaginary conversations and chastising courtiers for not greeting him properly. She adopted rituals that blended Catholic liturgy with invented penances. During one Lenten season, she ordered that all mirrors be removed from the palace, claiming that vanity was the root of the nation's suffering, and that she could no longer bear the sight of her own face, which she said bore the marks of eternal judgment. Servants were instructed to coat the windows in dark cloth to prevent the gaze of celestial beings. The atmosphere within her private chambers became funereal hermetic and steeped in apocalyptic symbolism. Despite her deteriorating state public acknowledgement of her madness, remained politically taboo. The Portuguese monarchy, already considered weak among European powers, could not afford the scandal of an incapacitated sovereign. Moreover, Maria's illness was cloaked in religious vocabulary, which complicated diagnosis and response. Was she mad or simply more pious than those around her? The line between prophecy and psychosis, between sainthood and insanity, was dangerously thin in a court still governed by rigid Catholic orthodoxy. It was during this period that her surviving son, João, began to assume greater control of state affairs. Though awkward and indecisive by nature, João possessed a cautious pragmatism that would prove essential in maintaining the illusion of normalcy. He became the unofficial regent, conducting government business from behind the scenes while issuing decrees in his mother's name. Diplomats increasingly addressed their communications to him, bypassing Maria altogether. Yet the fiction of her rule was maintained in ceremonial documents, portraits, and coinage. The deeper tragedy was that while João consolidated power quietly, his mother's suffering became the subject of both court gossip and medical experimentation. Physicians prescribed purges, cold baths, and prolonged confinement. In one disturbing episode, leeches were applied to her temples in an attempt to drain the humors believed to cause mental disturbance. Some physicians even suggested trepanation, the drilling of a hole in the skull, to relieve her spiritual pressure. These were ultimately dismissed, but the fact that such procedures were considered illustrates the limits of 18th century medical understanding. More than once, Maria physically resisted treatment. She screamed that doctors were agents of Satan come to destroy her soul. On one occasion, she bit a court physician attempting to administer laudanum, and on another, she hurled a crucifix at a nurse who had touched one of her sacred icons without permission. Her strength during these outbursts was noted with both awe and terror. She was known to overturn furniture strike attendants and tear religious texts to pieces if she believed they had been handled improperly. One of the most disturbing and lesser-known details of this period concerns Maria's personal chapel. A chambermaid testified in a private letter later found in the Torre do Tombo archive that the queen had begun keeping a wax effigy of Prince José, dressed in his formal attire, which she prayed to daily. She believed the figure would intercede on her behalf with God, and on several occasions she was found singing royal anthems to the effigy, sometimes stopping mid-verse to burst into tears or speak to it as though it were responding. The court-fearing scandal ordered the effigy destroyed in secret, which triggered a renewed wave of anguish when Maria discovered it missing. She reportedly believed that French revolutionaries had stolen it to undermine Portugal's divine protection. By the early 1790s, news of Maria's condition had begun to leak beyond the court. Foreign diplomats in Lisbon increasingly described the queen as unfit, tormented, and lost in visions. Britain and Spain both began conducting diplomatic affairs primarily with João, signaling de facto recognition of the Regency. Yet the court maintained the legal fiction of Maria's authority. To admit the queen's madness openly would be to jeopardize the monarchy's legitimacy and offer a pretext for internal revolt or external interference. It was in this context of uncertainty and concealment that Portugal began to feel the tremors of the French Revolution. The execution of Louis XVI in 1793 sent shockwaves through Europe, and monarchies scrambled to distance themselves from any perception of instability. For Portugal, already burdened by a monarch who could not appear in public without fear of a breakdown, the stakes were especially high. João responded by further tightening court access, censoring press reports, and reinforcing alliances with conservative powers. Meanwhile, Maria continued to drift deeper into psychosis. She stopped recognizing even her closest family members, and her religious visions became more elaborate. She claimed to see St. Francis hovering over her bed and insisted that she had received instructions to fast for 40 days to redeem the souls of Lisbon's sinners. At one point, she attempted to walk barefoot from the palace to the Carmo convent, only to collapse midway through and be carried back, delirious and singing psalms in Latin. The Queen of Portugal had become a living ghost, haunted, afflicted, and locked in a tragic symbiosis with the past. Her mind, once sharp and principled, now teetered on the edge of medieval mysticism and complete disintegration. And with no medical remedy available and no political will to depose her, Maria's torment would continue dragging her court ever closer to the brink of rupture. By the mid-1790s, the condition of Queen Maria I had deteriorated so severely that her delusions no longer ebbed and flowed, they dominated her daily life. The few lucid intervals that had once given hope to her court physicians and clergy had all but vanished. She had become a monarch in name only a vessel of divine torment, whose mind now seemed consumed by visions of fire judgment and spectral voices. The queen's apartments were converted into what was by all measures a prison, albeit one draped in velvet and gold. Inside her chambers, reality was replaced by a grim liturgy of fear and hallucination. Witnesses described long nights during which the queen could be heard wailing psalms through the thick stone corridors of the palace, her voice alternating between guttural sobs and high-pitched chants. She reportedly believed herself possessed by demons, and frequently demanded exorcisms from her confessors. When these priests hesitated, fearing scandal, she accused them of conspiring with Satan. In one episode, she hurled a brass crucifix across the room, breaking a mirror and then kneeling before the shards, whispering, "Even the reflection is corrupted." As her mental state worsened, Maria began performing bizarre rituals that frightened her household. At times, she refused to eat unless her food was first blessed by no fewer than 3 priests. She insisted on bathing in holy water and once attempted to scrub her own skin raw to remove the stain of idolatry. On Good Friday in 1796, she demanded that all palace servants wear funeral garb and walk barefoot through the halls while chanting Latin dirges. Those who refused were dismissed on charges of heresy. These behaviors were no longer hidden. Rumors circulated widely through Lisbon's upper classes, who relayed grotesque tales of the queen's behavior in coded language during dinners and salons. Diplomats from France and Austria described a monarch too far gone to speak coherently and liable to cry out mid-conversation about hellfire and vengeance. Yet still Maria retained the title of queen. There was no precedent for a regency grounded in madness, and no minister dared challenge the sanctity of the crown directly. Behind the scenes, Joan's power grew. Though he was never formally crowned during Maria's lifetime, Joan became the recognized political head of state after 1792, when his mother was declared incapable of ruling by the Council of State, albeit in guarded and legalistic terms. He governed from the Ajuda Palace, where court business could proceed without interference from his mother's tormented quarters. His rule was conservative and cautious, shaped not only by his personality, but by the constant pressure to maintain the illusion that the monarchy was still whole. Medical interventions continued more desperate than ever. In 1798, a prominent Italian physician, Vincenzo Chiarugi, was consulted through diplomatic intermediaries. Though he declined to travel to Lisbon, his recommendations reflect the period's crude psychiatry. He advised cold immersions confinement in a padded chamber and a strict regimen of silent prayer. These methods, based on Enlightenment ideas of humane treatment, never reached Maria. The queen remained isolated in her palatial crypt, tended by servants who had learned to ignore the screaming and barricade doors during her violent fits. Disturbingly, these fits grew more violent during religious festivals, when the contrast between her former ceremonial splendor and her current isolation seemed to trigger episodes of psychotic rage. One particularly chilling incident occurred during Corpus Christi in 1799. As the royal chapel was filled with incense and sacred music, Maria was said to have clawed her way through her chamber door and stumbled into the corridor, shrieking that the host was a false idol and that only suffering is holy. Guards restrained her, and the incident was hushed up, but whispers reached the foreign embassies within days. Not all details from this period have survived. The royal household kept few written records, and many of those were deliberately destroyed or altered during Joan's regency. Yet private letters and testimonies provide glimpses of the atmosphere. One attendant wrote that Maria had begun to mutilate sacred texts, tearing pages from Bibles, and licking the ink in an effort to ingest the word. Another account described how she once forced a servant to kneel for hours before a statue of Saint Dominic, berating him for having impure thoughts about martyrdom. The lines between sanctity and desecration blurred completely in her perception. The same icons she had once revered were now vessels of accusation and wrath. She spoke of being judged nightly by a celestial tribunal, and claimed that the souls of unborn children had taken refuge in her walls. At times she would stuff cloth into the gaps between stones to keep the voices from escaping. Such episodes weren't merely private afflictions, they affected the operation of the monarchy itself. Policy decisions were delayed. International alliances strained. The legitimacy of Portuguese authority abroad began to wobble under the weight of silence and deception. In Lisbon, the public's understanding of their queen's state was uneven. Censorship was aggressive, and official portraits continued to depict Maria as calm and serene, seated on a throne of carved mahogany, with a crucifix in one hand and a globe in the other. But the truth filtered out in strange ways. Satirical broadsheets, quickly confiscated, depicted her conversing with ghosts or fleeing demons. One infamous engraving showed the queen in a cage attended by jesters dressed as monks. Though crude, these images reflected an uncomfortable reality. The monarch's madness had become an open secret. Yet despite everything, João refused to depose his mother. This may have been due to political prudence, filial loyalty, or religious deference. Regardless of motive, the result was an unprecedented experiment in dual monarchy, one crowned head, paralyzed by madness, the other uncoronated but effectively ruling. Historians still debate whether João's regency prolonged the crisis or preserved the monarchy. What is clear is that he walked a fine line between discretion and delusion, balancing the needs of the state with the need to protect his mother's legacy. As the century closed, Portugal stood on the threshold of seismic change. The Napoleonic Wars loomed ever closer. Revolutionary France had already shaken Iberia's foundations, and Spain's instability threatened to spill across the border. Maria, unaware of any of this, lived in a world shaped entirely by memory and mania. Time had collapsed for her. The future for the Queen of Portugal no longer existed, only the ghosts of her dead son, the wrath of her imagined sins, and the ever-approaching judgment she believed would consume her soul. The death of Prince José had shattered Queen Maria I's psychological world, but it was her refusal to let go of his physical presence that transformed her affliction from private torment into grotesque ritual. Though José had been properly embalmed and interred in the royal pantheon of the Braganza dynasty at the monastery of São Vicente de Fora, Maria continued to behave as though he were still physically present in the royal household. Her obsession with his memory turned into something far more disturbing: the incorporation of his corpse, symbolically and almost literally, into her daily life. While the embalming of royal bodies was a common practice throughout European courts, Maria's case took a bizarre turn when she insisted that items of José's burial wardrobe be preserved and returned to the palace. These included gloves, a sash, and a ceremonial cape worn during his investiture as Prince of Brazil. These relics, rather than being enshrined in a chapel or crypt, were placed in her private oratory, where Maria would conduct long sessions of prayer, weeping, and whispered dialogue. To her, these items were more than mementos. They were channels of communion with her son's soul, or as some suspected, his very essence. Aides reported that she spoke to José daily, usually in the early hours before dawn, addressing his garments as if they were inhabited. At first, these habits were dismissed by attendants as the rituals of a grief-stricken mother, but over time the queen's attachment deepened into pathology. She insisted on having his favorite food prepared and served on a separate table in her chambers. When servants failed to carry out these bizarre instructions, she accused them of treason and summoned confessors to exercise their insubordination. At least 2 eyewitnesses described scenes in which Maria ordered the clothing to be laid out on a chaise longue, propped as if worn by an invisible body. Candles were arranged around the figure, and the queen would kneel before it for hours, murmuring phrases like, "My son guide this kingdom, and forgive me, I failed you." These rituals were often accompanied by chanting periods of ecstatic laughter or abrupt shifts into sobbing. Her attendants, unable to intervene without risking her violent wrath, simply observed and recorded the incidents for João's private ministers. The queen's obsession extended into areas of ceremonial state life. She insisted that decrees issued in José's name before his death be read aloud during royal briefings. When corrected by aides, she would erupt in rage, calling them usurpers and blasphemers. She accused one courtier of having poisoned José's mind with revolutionary thoughts, and demanded that he be stripped of his titles, a punishment only averted by João's quiet intervention. One of the most unsettling elements of this period was the rumor, never officially confirmed, that the queen demanded the exhumation of her son's body. According to a French diplomatic report sent in 1799, Maria was overheard declaring that José's spirit was trapped and needed his remains to be brought back into proximity with the royal palace. While no public record exists of an exhumation, changes to the staffing of the royal pantheon, and the sudden reassignment of the priest in charge suggest that some incident, perhaps an attempted disinterment, did take place. Maria's fixation on Jose extended beyond her chambers. She began referring to him in formal correspondence, demanding that certain diplomatic letters be addressed jointly to Her Majesty and the Prince of Brazil, Jose. Clerks initially corrected these signatures in secret, but when Maria discovered the alterations, she flew into such a rage that she had to be sedated with opiates, a measure her physicians were using with increasing regularity, despite concern over its effects. Laudanum became a tool of compliance, rendering the queen docile during moments of extreme hysteria, only to leave her disoriented and paranoid upon waking. Her spiritual advisors attempted to redirect her obsession into sanctioned religious devotion, urging her to transfer her grief toward a Christ-like acceptance of loss. But Maria responded with hostility. In her mind, Jose's death was not a test of faith, but an indictment of it. She declared that God had withdrawn his presence from Portugal and that Jose was the last worthy soul to walk the earth. When a Jesuit priest urged her to abandon these errors, she expelled him from court and banned all Jesuit preaching for 6 months. By 1800, her court had become a shrine to the dead. Visitors to the palace, few and tightly screened, were warned in advance not to speak of Jose's death, not to question the queen's rituals, and not to react if she addressed empty chairs or gestured toward invisible presences. Those who failed to comply risked abrupt dismissal, or in one case, physical assault. A visiting Spanish nobleman recorded in his private journal that he had been struck across the face by the queen after failing to respond to an introduction to her son. Even João, now functioning fully as regent, avoided direct contact with his mother whenever possible. Their relationship, once marked by mutual respect, had devolved into avoidance and controlled distance. João knew that any interruption to her rituals might provoke a violent episode. He quietly assigned a team of clergy and physicians to monitor her health, but ordered them to withhold diagnoses from the public. The fiction of her sanctity and authority had to be preserved, even as her mind disintegrated under the weight of religious delusion and traumatic grief. One chilling moment came during the Feast of All Souls in 1801. Maria insisted that a mass be conducted in her private chapel, attended by the court's most senior clerics. She arrived draped in Jose's cape and refused to sit, declaring that his spirit was already occupying the chair beside hers. When the officiant began the Requiem Mass, Maria interrupted to proclaim that she had been commanded by the dead prince to consecrate the Portuguese crown anew, this time in ashes. She produced a handful of cinders, declared them sacred, and scattered them on the altar. The service was terminated early and the priests left in silence. These episodes were not merely tragic, they were corrosive to the very institution of monarchy. The queen's inability to release her son's memory or recognize his death undermined the succession, weakened public confidence, and signaled to foreign courts that Portugal's leadership was fundamentally unstable. More than just madness, Maria's behavior had become a national vulnerability. Yet no one dared say so aloud. And so, day by day, the Queen of Portugal ruled a court of ghosts. Draped in mourning, consumed by grief, and surrounded by relics of the dead, she lived in a world where time had stopped in 1788. Her son was still with her, dressed, seated, addressed, while the living held their breath, waiting for the moment when her mind might finally release him. That moment never came. The court's patience and protective secrecy regarding Queen Maria I's madness could not hold indefinitely. By the early 1800s, political and military pressures on the Iberian Peninsula were mounting rapidly. Europe was being reshaped by the Napoleonic Wars, and Portugal's position as a small Catholic monarchy allied with Britain had become increasingly precarious. The Queen's incapacitation, once a private burden, now represented a liability on the global stage. Her regency, sustained for over a decade under João's management, stood at a crossroads. Could the monarchy continue to operate with a sovereign who believed she was haunted by her dead son's voice? Internally, Portugal was growing tense. The collapse of Spain's central authority under Napoleon's pressure and the subsequent invasion of Iberia placed the Portuguese court in direct danger. João, though cautious by temperament, recognized that France viewed Portugal's loyalty to Britain as intolerable. A rupture was inevitable. And while João quietly directed affairs of state, every decision was made under the shadow of his mother's name. Each decree, each alliance, each act of defense bore the seal of a queen who had not addressed her ministers coherently in over a decade. In 1801, that vulnerability was tested during the War of the Oranges when Spain, under French pressure, launched a brief invasion of Portuguese territory. The resulting Treaty of Badajoz forced Portugal to cede land and close its ports to British ships. For João and his ministers, the humiliation highlighted an impossible contradiction. The regent needed full authority to act decisively, but the fiction of Maria's rule constrained him legally and diplomatically. Publicly removing her would ignite controversy both at home and abroad, and so the solution remained informal, complete regency in all but name. Behind palace doors, however, Maria's deterioration demanded increasing management. Court schedules were rewritten to accommodate her cycles of hysteria and silence. Servants timed meals and medical doses to avoid agitation. One physician noted that she had developed a fixed horror of daylight, refusing to allow sunlight into her chambers. Lamps were kept dim and heavy curtains covered the windows. Her world became one of shadows and muttering prayer. When her son João visited something he did infrequently and with careful planning, he found a woman physically diminished but spiritually aflame. She rarely recognized him by name and sometimes addressed him as a priest, a courtier, or her husband. On occasion, she would berate him for not protecting José's tomb or accuse him of having abandoned the body to rot. João responded with dutiful calm, but increasingly delegated all contact to her confessor and chief physician. He ruled in her name, but she had become a burden of statecraft, not a participant in it. Some of the most troubling accounts from this period come from the Queen's immediate attendants, ladies-in-waiting, and chambermaids tasked with managing her day-to-day needs. One such servant, later interviewed in Exile, described how the Queen had taken to blessing random objects, furniture door handles, candle holders as if they held sacred power. She would spend hours arranging and rearranging these items, muttering cryptic phrases about penance and purification. Attempts to interrupt her were met with screams or threats of divine vengeance. In rare moments of calm, Maria would demand elaborate rituals. She instructed that Mass be conducted at irregular hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, and insisted that any priest who officiated undergo a full confession immediately beforehand. She wore mourning black constantly, her garments layered and increasingly soiled as she refused replacement garments not explicitly sanctified. Reports indicate that she kept objects of mortification in her chambers, hair shirts, spiked girdles, and a crude whip, all of which she used privately, believing she could cleanse the sins of her people through personal suffering. By 1805, Maria's mental and physical state had become so compromised that even her existence posed a security concern. There were fears that agents sympathetic to Napoleon might exploit her condition to destabilize the monarchy, or even kidnap the Queen to force João's hand diplomatically. For this reason, her rooms were guarded constantly with strict limits on who could enter. Her medical records were treated as classified documents, and correspondence mentioning her mental state was burned after review. Still, the court preserved the appearance of continuity. Public festivals were staged as if the Queen still held sway. Her name continued to appear on official proclamations. Portraits of her remained on display across the empire. Behind these facades, João moved to consolidate his hold on the court, gradually replacing older advisors with loyalists who recognized the necessity of total regency. Yet the underlying contradiction remained. Portugal was governed by a man who had not yet assumed the crown in the name of a woman, no longer aware she ruled. As France prepared its full-scale invasion of Portugal in 1807, João faced an agonizing decision. With Napoleon's armies advancing through Spain and pressure mounting on Lisbon, the British proposed an evacuation of the royal family to Brazil, Portugal's richest colony, and crucially far beyond Napoleon's reach. João, ever cautious, hesitated. Leaving Lisbon would mean abandoning centuries of dynastic tradition. It would also mean transporting his mother, now virtually catatonic for long stretches and violently reactive during others. Yet the alternative capture by the French was far worse. Napoleon had already deposed the Spanish Bourbon monarchy, placing his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. There was every reason to believe he would do the same in Portugal, replacing the Braganzas with a Bonaparte puppet. To maintain sovereignty, João chose exile. Preparations began in secrecy, but inevitably rumors spread. Among the court's greatest logistical challenges was the transport of Queen Maria. She required a team of attendants, physicians, and guards to ensure she neither harmed herself nor others. The royal fleet was modified to accommodate her condition. Her quarters were isolated, soundproofed, and outfitted with heavy curtains and religious paraphernalia. Physicians administered increasing doses of laudanum to keep her calm, though the drug's long-term use had left her prone to hallucination tremors and incoherent babbling. When the Braganza family finally departed Lisbon in November 1807, they left under cover of night. The city, aware of what was happening but powerless to intervene, watched in silent confusion as the royal family fled aboard British ships. Among them, cloistered in a chamber aboard the Medusa, was the queen clutching a worn sash that had once belonged to José, rocking gently and whispering prayers to saints no longer recognized. The journey to Brazil would mark the final stage of her life. But the regime she left behind, defined by secrecy, anxiety, and whispered rituals, was itself a kind of living tomb. For over 15 years, Portugal had been ruled in the name of a woman who spoke to ghosts, feared sunlight, and believed the kingdom's salvation rested in the preservation of a corpse. The voyage to Brazil in late 1807 was both unprecedented and desperate. A dynastic transplant across the Atlantic executed under the threat of Napoleonic invasion. For the Portuguese monarchy, it represented survival. For Queen Maria I, it marked an exodus into permanent twilight. Removed from the city she once ruled, separated from the palace corridors where she had wandered in madness, and distanced from her son's tomb, Maria entered her final chapter, one that unfolded thousands of miles from Lisbon, in the humid and unfamiliar courts of Rio de Janeiro. Though nominally the sovereign, Maria was now entirely isolated from affairs of state. Her transfer aboard the royal ship Medusa had been a delicate operation. Throughout the voyage, she remained heavily sedated, prone to bursts of incoherent speech and long periods of staring blankly at nothing. Reports from her physicians describe episodes of crying out for José, calling upon angels, and denouncing herself as the witch of Babylon. Crew members were ordered not to speak of what they saw. Even the ship's logs omit references to the queen's condition. After nearly 2 months at sea, the Portuguese court disembarked in Rio de Janeiro in early 1808. The city was stunned. Never before had a European sovereign relocated their entire court to a colony. João set about transforming Rio into a de facto royal capital. Institutions were transplanted, government offices established, and Brazilian elites drawn into an imperial orbit they had never imagined occupying. But while João expanded royal authority in exile, Maria was hidden away in the background, increasingly a relic of an old world fading rapidly under the pressures of war, distance, and illness. The queen was housed in a wing of the Convento de Carmo, a former religious complex in the heart of Rio. There, under tight supervision, she lived surrounded by the rituals and objects that had defined her delusions in Lisbon. Her rooms were once again draped in black fabric, her windows shuttered, and her attendants instructed to accommodate the old patterns. Periods of prayer recitations to her dead son and sudden, unprompted proclamations of judgment. Occasionally, the sounds of her cries echoed through the convent's stone corridors. One visiting British official recorded being disturbed by the unmistakable howls of a woman in torment, and had to be reassured that it was only Her Majesty in prayer. Even in Brazil, the charade of sovereignty persisted. Court documents continued to carry her name. Official events were staged in her honor, though she never appeared. João's regency, now open and acknowledged, still paid symbolic homage to the Mother Queen, whose grip on reality had entirely dissolved. Physicians in Rio attempted modest interventions. One English doctor familiar with emerging psychiatric theories recommended open air and structured routines. But Maria's attendants rejected these ideas, fearing they would provoke agitation or violate her holy suffering. Others suggested her madness might have subsided if she were returned to Lisbon near José's tomb. João, aware of the impossibility of such a reversal, ordered no changes. Her isolation continued. The queen's condition by this point was characterized by long periods of silence, interrupted by ritualized actions, rocking back and forth, muttering litanies, and rearranging religious relics. She had lost most of her teeth, required assistance for movement, and could barely eat without help. And yet she retained moments of startling clarity. A priest in her service wrote that on one occasion Maria suddenly asked, "Why does the son not return? Has he abandoned his kingdom?" A sentence interpreted as both theological and personal. These glimpses, however, were rare and never sustained. In Rio's elite circles, Maria became a ghostly legend. Foreign dignitaries heard conflicting accounts. Some said she had recovered and lived peacefully in cloistered piety. Others whispered that she was kept in chains or confined to a cell. The truth, far more complex and tragic, was that the queen lived in a constructed world maintained by loyal servants and sanctioned delusion. There was no question of recovery, no plan for reintegration. She was revered, pitied, and ignored in equal measure. The years passed. João solidified control over Brazil, elevating its status to that of a co-equal kingdom within the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves in 1815. The move was pragmatic. It gave constitutional justification for the royal court's continued presence, but also symbolic. Portugal, for the first time, was ruled from abroad. The country's monarch was a regent, its queen a recluse, increasingly unrecognizable even to those who had once known her. In her final years, Maria became nearly unresponsive. Attendants noted that she no longer reacted to music or prayers. She would sometimes reach out to objects that weren't there, or respond to voices only she could hear. Her body became frail, her skin paper-thin and marked by pressure wounds. She no longer recognized João nor any other members of her family. Her mind, having circled in obsessive grief for decades, now floated in a fog of complete unknowing. But even in this state, her religious fervor had not entirely vanished. One nun recounted how Maria, in a rare burst of clarity, grabbed her rosary and repeated a single word, misericordia, over and over again until her voice faded. Whether this was a moment of awareness or a final retreat into learned habit remains uncertain. By now, no one could say where Maria's soul lived on earth in penance or trapped in the purgatory she had long feared. On March 20th, 1816, Queen Maria I of Portugal died in Rio de Janeiro at the age of 81. She passed quietly without ceremony in a darkened room surrounded by religious icons and the few attendants who had remained loyal to her for decades. News of her death was received in Lisbon with solemn rituals but little real emotion. The monarchy had functioned without her for so long that her passing marked not a rupture but a belated closure. Her body was eventually returned to Portugal in 1821, years after her death, and interred with full honors in the Estrela Basilica in Lisbon, a church she had commissioned in her early reign, before madness overtook her. The ceremony was dignified but restrained. Few now remembered the queen as she once had been, a pious reformer, a sovereign of principle, and a woman who sought to rule with justice in accordance with her faith. She had become in public memory Maria the Mad, a monarch broken by grief, obsessed with death, and remembered more for her sorrow than her statecraft. But the tragedy of her madness was never simply personal. It had altered the course of Portuguese history, shaped the governance of an empire, and left an indelible scar on the institution of monarchy itself. With the death of Queen Maria beyond 1816, João officially ascended to the throne as King João VI. The regency he had carried for nearly a quarter century was finally legitimized by formal succession. Yet the transition was curiously subdued. Maria's long mental illness had already erased her from practical governance, and in the eyes of many within the empire, João had been king in all but name for years. Still, the symbolic shift was undeniable. Portugal had moved from a reign haunted by spiritual torment to one dominated by political instability and colonial crisis. Maria's madness left a vacuum of authority that João had struggled to fill through quiet pragmatism and cautious diplomacy. But while João had maintained continuity, the cost had been high stagnation at home, mounting unrest in Brazil, and an institutional culture of denial and passivity. These patterns had crystallized during Maria's mental collapse and extended far beyond her death. One immediate consequence of her illness had been the weakening of monarchical prestige. While the court had meticulously maintained the appearance of a functioning sovereign, the reality had long been known both domestically and abroad. Foreign diplomats routinely bypassed Maria, and even within Portugal her name on legal decrees had become a fiction of necessity. The prolonged concealment of her madness, though intended to preserve the monarchy's dignity, ironically diminished it. Rule by a sovereign who could not speak, act, or reason created a monarchy defined by absence. Compounding this was the rise of Brazilian autonomy during the royal family's exile. João, forced to govern from Rio de Janeiro, transformed the colony into an imperial center, an outcome unthinkable in the 18th century. Yet his mother's illness had in a sense enabled this shift. Had Maria been functional, the transfer of the court might have provoked greater resistance or been deemed sacrilegious. But with the queen's silenced by madness, João could act with wide latitude under the guise of emergency governance. Maria's mental state also shaped perceptions of female rulership in Portugal and beyond. As the first undisputed queen regnant in Portuguese history, her collapse provided fuel to conservative thinkers who argued against female sovereignty altogether. Enlightenment philosophers, particularly in France and Spain, cited her reign as evidence that emotional weakness and religious fanaticism made women unfit to rule. These interpretations, though deeply gendered and rooted in patriarchal bias, nonetheless gained traction, reinforcing pre-existing hierarchies that would persist well into the 19th century. And yet Maria's reign cannot be reduced to her illness alone. For a brief period between 1777 and 1786, she had ruled with competence, piety, and a genuine sense of justice. She had reversed the authoritarian excesses of the Marquis of Pombal, defended ecclesiastical independence, and attempted to govern as a moral steward of the realm. Her early reforms, while limited in scope, reflected a conscientious monarch who understood power as a divine trust rather than a personal entitlement. The tragedy was not simply that she went mad, but that her madness obliterated the memory of her accomplishments. The psychological dimension of Maria's life, rarely explored in official records, offers insights into the limits of monarchical responsibility. Raised in an environment of extreme religiosity, surrounded by omens of disaster and burdened with dynastic duty, she internalized her role not as a privilege but as a sacrificial obligation. Her belief that personal sin could doom an entire kingdom was not an eccentricity. It was the logical endpoint of a theological worldview in which monarchy and divinity were indivisible. When tragedy struck first in the form of her husband's death, then her son's, she interpreted these losses as divine retribution. Her madness was not a break from her role as queen, but a grotesque extension of it. The ritual she performed, the preservation of José's clothing, the whispered conversations with relics, the self-inflicted penance, were not delusions in the abstract. They were in her mind acts of governance. She was ruling spiritually even as she lost all grasp on political reality. This fusion of monarchy and martyrdom made her illness particularly resistant to treatment. Neither physicians nor clerics could separate her identity from her suffering. To strip her of her rituals would be to strip her of her crown. In the broader context of European history, Maria's reign was one of many monarchies tested by personal instability. George III of Britain, suffering his own bouts of mental illness, had likewise required a regency. But the British system had mechanisms, parliamentary oversight, legal precedent for such a transition. Portugal had no such clarity. The Braganças relied on secrecy, improvisation, and a culture of deference that masked dysfunction with ritual. The result was a monarchy outwardly preserved but inwardly eroding. Maria's death did not immediately resolve these tensions. João VI, though a stabilizing figure, struggled to manage the contradictions inherited from his regency, a European kingdom governed from South America, a court steeped in Old World ceremonialism, amid New World revolutionary fervor, and a political culture shaped by decades of silence. The seeds of Brazilian independence, formally declared in 1822 by João's own son Pedro, were sown in the soil of Maria's madness and João's accommodation to it. Queen Maria, your legacy remains complex. She is remembered variously as Maria the Pious and Maria the Mad, a woman whose faith and fragility blurred into one. Her story is often reduced to spectacle, the screaming, the embalmed clothing, the whispered prayers to her dead son. But beneath these lurid details lies a deeper narrative, one of duty, guilt, power, and the limits of human endurance under the crushing weight of monarchy. Her life reminds us that behind the crown lies a person subject not only to the demands of governance but to the raw pressures of grief, expectation, and belief. And when those forces exceed what the mind can bear, even the throne cannot offer refuge. The long arc of Queen Maria's life, marked by early promise, tragic loss, and sustained mental collapse, left a subtle yet profound imprint on the Portuguese monarchy and its empire. Her descent into madness, rather than being a footnote to her reign, shaped the political architecture of an entire era. For nearly 30 years, governance in Portugal was conducted in the shadow of a queen, who could no longer govern, whose name remained on decrees long after her mind had disintegrated. and whose presence hovered like an unresolved prayer over court and colony alike. Her son and successor, King João VI, would go on to oversee the most consequential transformation in Portuguese imperial history, the elevation of Brazil from colony to co-kingdom, and its eventual path to independence. These developments were in part the unintended outcome of Maria's incapacity. Her prolonged absence from power created both a vacuum and a flexibility, one that João cautiously navigated to preserve dynastic continuity in extraordinary circumstances. Yet it was also her absence that weakened the moral authority of monarchy, eroding public confidence in a regime that had become synonymous with denial ritual and stagnation. In death, as in life, Maria was remembered through the lens of contradiction. Religious chroniclers cast her suffering as sanctified endurance proof of a soul tested by God. Enlightenment thinkers, by contrast, interpreted her madness as the natural outcome of clerical overreach and dynastic inbreeding. Neither view fully captures the depth of her tragedy, a sovereign raised to see herself as the spiritual mother of her people, broken by loss and ultimately entombed first in her chambers, then in memory. Today her legacy lingers quietly. The Estrela Basilica in Lisbon, where she now rests, stands as a monument to the early hopes of her reign, a structure she commissioned in devotion, completed just as her mind began to fracture. It is a paradox in stone, a testament to faith and statecraft erected by a queen who in the end could no longer distinguish between them.